People who claim, and this is from The Guardian, people who claim that population growth is the big environmental issue are shifting the blame from the rich to the poor. This follows a long tradition of the rich trying to control reproduction of the poor. Now, sometimes reproduction of the poor needs to be controlled, it's true, but the best contraceptive in any country that is in need of development is education of women. It's not passing out of contraceptive devices. So education and empowerment of women is the key. But in the past, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, and there are Canadian examples, I'm going to mention one in a moment, were very keen on passing out the technology without attending to the fundamental institutional problem, which was inequality, class inequality, gender inequality, lack of food distribution, this kind of thing. Lack of recognition that women are growing most of the food in many of these countries. They give the technology to the men. The Canadian example is rather fascinating. Kaufman in Kitchener-Waterloo offered in 1929 in the Depression, he offered his laid-off workers birth control information or free sterilization instead of jobs. Now this is a Canadian example, but it kind of shows the folly of what's going on in many world programs that distribute contraception without understanding what the fundamental underlying inequalities are. But he says this, I found the less intelligence, the larger the family, the more helpless their condition. I cannot meet competition by using inferior help, and decided that by employing such help merely enabled them to increase the social problem by raising more unfortunate handicapped children. This is a quote from The Guardian. This is not my quote. It's no coincidence that most of those who are obsessed with population growth are post-reproductive, wealthy white men. And you saw that in the Billionaires Club. It's about the only environmental issue for which they cannot be blamed. Inequality and distribution. The places where population growth has been fastest are those where environmental degradation, however you measure it, is the slowest. So we have a kind of issue there that maybe we should be more like them, if we use this we and them that Brewster was playing with. Those who live by processing waste, which is a large portion of the urban underclass, and most of the developing world is urban underclass now, often save more greenhouse gases than they produce. So there's a weak correlation between global warming and population growth. There's a strong correlation between global warming and wealth. Now this is another little cartogram where I've shown world consumption, and again, it's the size of the consumers is blown up, and you can see what happens to Latin America and Africa. They shrivel up. Canada's there, but it's not as big a consumer as Japan, Europe. Well, the United States is the biggest and bright, bright red. And I think that talks about those Hummers that I saw driving around when I lived in the United States these past 2 years. It's quite remarkable. The old development formula used to be that total impact on the environment equals population times affluence times technology. Now that has been pretty well identified through serious research as being wrong. The new formula is that total impact equals consumers times affluence times technology. The relationship of consumption overall to environmental problems also applies to food. The more indirect the consumption pattern, the more processed the food, the higher the level of problems. So if you eat rice or another staple, the environmental footprint is less heavy. Hunger exists in affluent societies such as Canada not because of population pressures, but because available food, which gets thrown out, and thrown out by lots of us every day, and certainly by restaurants and by supermarkets, does not get to those who need it, while others are we're tossing food away. Homeless men in Canada now have life expectancies of a young man in Canada in 1921. It's kind of shocking, but this is a longitudinal study that found this in 2009. So hunger is rampant among the poor in developing societies and those of all statuses in societies with agricultural catastrophes. And this has to be identified too. Food distribution is not even. There are catastrophes all over the world. In many places like Bangladesh, like Malaysia, subject to tsunamis, subject to typhoons, drought in Africa. None of this is closely linked to population size or growth. 195 million children in developing countries suffer stunted growth as a result of malnutrition. Would smaller families help that? Probably not. If they would a little bit, they wouldn't much at all. The G8 giving something back to Mother Africa. We all did our part. And they're all throwing pennies in her little bowl and going back. And here's the World Economic Forum. There's so many sessions. I can't decide between hunger and poverty, she says, in her fur coat, and he in his fur coat with his cigar. Consumption and footprints is a fascinating graph. The big bump there is the United States. Right next to the United States, the next one over to the right, is Cuba. The fact that the United States and Cuba have almost identical life expectancies with tremendously different costs for the life expectancies they produce to be is astounding. We have an issue that jumps right out at us. Okay, population aging. I just want to mention this in passing because there seems to be a pretty standard understanding that less developed countries are young and more developed countries are really old, and our problem is we're getting too old, whereas less developed countries are far too young. The reality is, over the next 5 decades, all of the increase in population aging will come from less developed countries. Now, it may not be that they're living to 85, it may be they're living to 55, but they're going to have disproportionate numbers of people who are older. Now, I'll leave it to you to figure out whether that's a problem, if it is a problem, but it's a fact that I think has to be addressed because it creates different constituencies of gender, because women live longer than men, of family relations, and it exacerbates many gender inequalities where if women are treated badly when they're young, they're treated really badly when they're old. And that occurs in our society as well, where we have the combination of ageism and sexism. So we have some real serious issues there of food distribution, and when food is available, is it going to old women in the future? The conundrum of population aging, it's a sign of progress, at least somewhat, of adequate food, public hygiene. Yet more elders in LDCs, I just went to an international conference on this, will be living with disabilities. The more developed countries were lucky to be rich before old. The less developed countries will become old before they're rich. The problem, in my view, is not population per se, although within population there are many issues, but inequalities and distribution of food. This is my last slide. I thank you very much.
Susan is a Canadian sociologist, social demographer with active interest in social policy. She is an advisor to governments in Canada, the UK, and the European Union in social statistics, social policies, and science, technology, and innovation policies, and official data collection. She is principal investigator of various studies. Her research is on life course, demographic aging, generational relations, family change, and social impacts of technology. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, professor of sociology at universities of Alberta, Waterloo, and Windsor, and the recipient of many research and teaching awards. In 2002, she was awarded the University Cup by the University of Alberta for a career record of excellence in both research and teaching. She was awarded the lifetime honorific title Distinguished University Professor and was 2007-2009 Senior Scholar, Institute of Public and International Affairs, and Professor of Family and Consumer Studies at the University of Utah. In summer 2009, she became the Prentice Research Chair in Global Population and Economy, Director of the Prentice Institute, and Professor of Sociology at the University of Lethbridge. She is the author of 7 books and research monographs, over 170 research articles and book chapters, and is a frequent keynote speaker at national and international conferences.